Hello, I'm Mark McNeil. I'm pleased to be discussing integrating aspects of divine command theory with natural law and virtue theory. I rely heavily on the chapter in Craig S. Evans' book, God and Moral Obligation, and quote extensively from his book. Let's get started. I'm going to be providing an introduction and then discussing terminology of divine command theory, natural law, and virtue theory, and then discussing how all three are integrated. And finally, I'll give a conclusion. C.S. Lewis begins his book Mere Christianity with an illustration of human nature from Coraline. There is often an appeal to some standard of behavior that one expects everyone to know about. The other person seldom replies to hell with your standard. Instead, he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. Lewis says that quarreling means trying to show that the other person is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Marjorie Taylor Greene told the New York Times she wasn't worried about GOP pushback due to her State of the Union behavior. She said, I have the Speaker's support and he has mine after Biden's address. Basically, she is saying that we should tell the truth and that President Biden was not following the standard of truth-telling during his State of the Union address. Divine command theory. It can be defined as moral obligations. Craig Evans says that the value of God-given moral principles of obligations are not burdensome limitations on autonomy, but a gift for which we should be grateful. We need to recover the vision of the moral law as a gift intended for human flourishing, a view that is clearly articulated in the attitude of the Jewish people towards the Torah. Rather, an obligation is a distinctive kind of reason with several important features. It can bring closure to deliberation, since even to deliberate about whether I should do what I am morally obligated to do is usually a sign of moral weakness. There is someone who has the right to expect me to perform the act, and who may rightly be disappointed in me and blame me if I fail to perform the act, and it has a binary verdict-like character. Although moral obligations are aimed at the good, they are not reducible to the good. An act might be good to do, even the best act a person could possibly do in some situations, without necessarily being a moral obligation. There are normative truths about the social relation of creature to creator. It will be true with respect to this relation, as in others. Someone who has graciously been given a great good should be grateful to the benefactor, and that someone who has acted in a loving way is deserving of being loved in return, and these truths are independent of any commands God has given. If God exists and humans are his creation, then the relation between creature and creator is a genuine social relation and carries certain distinctive obligations. Viewing moral obligations as divine commands makes more sense than any alternative account. The modal status thesis refers to the particular moral status that arises by virtue of God's commands. An act such as stealing may have a moral character, but God's command against stealing introduces a new character to the situation. Now let's talk about natural law. Natural law refers to a system of right or justice held to be common to all humans and derived from nature rather than from rules of society or positive law. Early formulations of natural law come from Aristotle, who held that what was just by nature was not always the same as what was just by law, that there is natural justice valid everywhere with the same force and not existing by people thinking this or that, and that appeal could be made to it from positive law. Skipping down to the Apostle Paul, he described a law written in the hearts of the Gentiles in Romans 2:14-15. In the Enlightenment and the modern era, Thomas Hobbes defined the right of nature to be liberty, the liberty each man hath to use his own power for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of life, and a law of nature, as a precept or general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life. Rousseau postulated a savage who was virtuous in isolation and acted by two principles prior to reason: self-preservation and compassion, that is, innate repugnance to the suffering of others. Natural law is written by God in the hearts of men, according to the Apostle Paul. In Evans' book, he quotes Mark Murphy, who argues in God and Moral Law that God's relation to morality should be conceived as a form of concurrentism, i.e., a medieval doctrine that holds that God is immediately, causally involved in every event of nature, and yet so are the creatures. Evans argues that someone who reasonably accepts the existence of morality might be brought to see the reasonableness of believing in God as the explanation of a part of morality, namely moral obligations. The role God plays in giving the natural world a structure in which things have natures that determine what is good for them is important, although a natural law ethic can be developed without God's involvement. When God is part of the picture, the story seems far more complete and satisfying. Divine command theory can integrate with natural law. Divine command theory presupposes some account of what is good, and a natural law view of the good is consistent and especially well suited for this purpose. Widespread human belief includes gratitude toward the giver of a good gift, and the good is to be appreciated. It is good to feel and express gratitude towards the gift giver. The relationship of the creature to the Creator is a distinctive kind of social relationship as a parent to a child. Third, for divine command theory to be plausible, there must be some reasonable answer to the question, why should a human being obey the commands of God? The three answers given by Evans are gratitude for the good gift, for relation with the Creator. The purpose of God's command is a transformation that enables us to flourish and achieve true happiness. And thirdly, God owns his creation. God has a right to establish rules for how humans should conduct themselves. Human freedom is a gracious gift of God, which does not nullify God's ownership of creation. Natural law needs divine command. Natural law needs for moral obligations. Discretion thesis claims that God has some choice about what he commands, but those who affirm discretion thesis hold that some of what God commands is commanded necessarily. The modal status thesis claims that an act God commands acquires a particular moral status in part by virtue of his commands. Therefore, the discretion thesis is denied because the morally right is fixed and all God's commands have a particular moral status. A natural law ethic without divine authority will have difficulty making sense of the special character of moral duties. Now let's talk about virtue ethics. Virtue ethics refers to the central role played in ethics by long-term dispositional states, that is, virtues of the character of moral agents. Some of these virtues are honesty, courage, loyalty, and justice, while some of the deficiencies, that is, vices, are cowardice, laziness, and dishonesty. We are skeptical about the existence of global character traits. Behavior is strongly shaped by the effects of special situations and contexts. Thomas Aquinas sees virtue as the proper end of law and not a rival. The proper effect of law is good for those to whom it is given. If a natural law ethic is consistent with the divine command theory and natural law ethic logically requires a virtue ethic, then it must be the case that a divine command theory is also a virtue ethic. Those who count such things tell us that there are a total of 613 commandments recorded in the Old Testament. The New Testament describes a situation where a lawyer trying to tempt and entrap Jesus asked, "Which commandment is the greatest?" Jesus replied by quoting one solitary commandment from Deuteronomy 6:5, "And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might." And the second is like it, quoting Leviticus 19:18, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus summed virtually all the commandments into these two. The event is recorded in the three Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Paul echoes Jesus in Romans 13:9-10, saying that all of the commands of God are summed up in the commands to love the neighbor, and thus love is the fulfillment of the law. The supreme commands in Christianity are in fact commands to acquire virtues. Further connections are shown when Paul gives the command in Romans 12:2 to be transformed by the renewing of your mind, a duty to seek to become a different type of person, which he describes later in the chapter in verses 12-13 in terms of virtues: joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer, share with those in need, and practice hospitality. The motivational focus is not on law for the sake of law, but fulfilling law out of love for the lawgiver. The commands are usually accompanied by promises of blessing for those who keep God's laws. The biblical writers did not see God's commands as burdensome, but a positive choice for blessing. We see then the virtues as the telos of moral duty. Kierkegaard argues that the common view that genuine love must be spontaneous and free from any sense of obligation is mistaken. Only when it is a duty to love, and only when love is eternally secured against every change, eternally and happily secured against despair. Our two supreme duties are to love God unconditionally and to love our neighbors. Kierkegaard describes someone who has learned from Christianity the importance of moral duty, but thinks that the moral law needs no divine lawgiver. God and the world agree in this, that love is the fulfilling of the law. The difference, though, is that the world understands the law as something it thinks up by itself. Since love is fulfilling the law, perhaps such a person at least begins to resemble Kant's idea of a being who has no need of duties or obligations. Moral duties might have as part of their function the goal of assisting us to become perfected saints, or at least as moving us in that direction. I think it is plausible that if we think of God's commands as aimed at helping us to become friends of God, people who can enjoy an intimate personal knowledge of God and relationship with Him, the main obstacle to such a relation to God is surely our character. Continuing on, then, divine command theory requires an account of the virtues in order for us to fully understand the point of our duties. Kierkegaard speaks of the moral law as a school. Though the moral law aims at our transformation, it begins by helping us to see how much we need to be transformed. It points to a problem of moral guilt and a need for atonement that requires more than a philosophical remedy. All right, let's sum it up. We've talked about divine command theory, we've talked about natural law, and we've talked about virtue ethic and how they are an integrated, how Evans sees them as an integrated whole. He says that divine command theory is not a complete ethic. It rests on a framework of normative truths, including an account of the good, such as natural law theory provides, and it needs an account of the virtues as well. Natural law and virtues answer different questions than a divine command theory and provide a context that transforms our understanding of moral obligations. The life of duty may be transitional, even if the transition period is one's entire lifetime. The objective is to approximate the life of the saint perfected in love, even short of eternity. For such people, the life of duty becomes increasingly less central.